all the time is, are the most effective ways of doing what we do in the classroom and trying to find ways which will have the biggest impact on our students' learning. Okay? I first really started thinking about this a few years ago because I did a talk called 20 Things in 20 Years. And it was basically a kind of summary of 20 of the things I'd learned about language teaching, about publishing in my 20 years of teaching. It's now about 25 years of teaching, so that shows you this was an old talk. And in that talk, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was this idea that these kind of, I don't know, cult-like approaches, things like neuro-linguistic programming, learning styles, multiple intelligences, which had really started to sort of infiltrate themselves into many different levels of English language teaching, were actually things that had no basis in research and were really things that should be critically reappraised, shall we say. Anyone who does talks will know that, you can say something and you can hope that something will happen, but it doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen. And so I was very surprised a couple of years after this, when I did this initial talk, that Cambridge decided to remove the whole approach to learning styles from CELTA courses. Up until around this time, CELTA courses had still been insisting on including a focus on learning styles, even though there was a lot of research to suggest that most CELTA trainers didn't buy into the whole construct of learning styles. And I was very pleased to see that Cambridge had reacted to the kind of ongoing criticism of learning styles and removed it from CELTA courses. I don't think it was because of anything I said or did, but it was still nice that it kind of coincided with my own complaining about learning styles. And I think the reason that this is significant, the reason it's important that Cambridge removed learning styles from CELTA courses, and the reason it's important to think about research and to be informed in our classroom practice about research is simply because, as I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, we only have limited time available to develop and to learn our craft. And I think as a result, it's really important that in both our training and in our personal development, that we focus on things that have been proven to be effective. Sorry, 1 minute, let me just turn off my mail there to stop it pinging and beeping. Where are we? Yeah, sorry. So, I think it's important that we focus on things that are known to be effective, things that are backed up by, substantial body of research. And really what we should be focusing on, as I said, are things which make us maximally effective. You might be wondering, what do I mean by effective and how do we define effectiveness? Well, I think one way you can think about what makes teaching effective is it's teaching that leads to high achievement by students in outcomes that we see as being valuable and that the students see as being valuable under circumstances where otherwise all things are equal. And I think it makes sense to judge teaching and assess teaching, our own teaching and the teaching of others, on the impact that the teaching has on learning which is assessed. At the same time, of course, I think, we need to be cautious about claims about what's effective and what's not. I'm sure you're all very aware of sort of ridiculous claims that often get made in English language teaching about, you can develop from elementary to advanced in 3 months, these kind of claims. Luckily for all of us, I think, there's been a lot of research into what makes for effective teaching. Some of you may know the work of John Hattie. John Hattie is someone I've been reading a lot of over recent years. And I think, like a lot of quite interesting writers about education, he doesn't come from an English as a foreign language background. He's a sort of general academic and educational researcher. And he's written these 2 books, Visible Learning and the Science of How We Learn, and Visible Learning for Teachers. And basically what Hattie does is he kind of does studies of meta-studies. So he will read research papers that have been written by researchers who look at, say, 10 different papers about use of L1 in the classroom, and he will then read those papers that summarize bigger studies. So it's like a study of meta-studies, if you like. And basically what Hattie does is he looks at all the different influences or impacts on student learning across a whole wide range of subjects that have been explored in these kind of meta-studies. And he starts to rank them according to the size of the impact they have on learning. And one of the nice things about reading Hattie's work, one of the kind of good news stories for teachers, is that basically almost everything we do in class has some impact on learning, some kind of positive impact on learning. So hopefully, almost nothing that we do actually damages our learners. They get more from a whole range of different things that we do as teachers in the classroom than they would if they were just studying on their own. Given that, I guess, what we then need to be thinking about is what is it that works best, not just what works. Lots of things work, so what works best? Hattie has these kind of statistical details that he includes in his work. And he says the average effect size of a particular teacher act or teacher intervention is what he calls plus 0.4. If you have an effect size of 1, that's basically associated with pushing your learners' achievements forward by 1 year. Or if you prefer, improving the rate of learning, the speed of learning by 50%. So where you've got things which generally have a sort of 0.3 or smaller impact, this basically means it's quite a small impact. 0.3 to 0.6 is medium impact, and anything bigger than 0.6 in his study has a large effect on learning. Okay? Just some key findings before we do a quick test to see how aware of these things you are. Hattie concludes that basically between 60 and 70% of us as teachers across the board, whatever subject we're teaching, are doing things in class that make a large difference, whether we know it or not. Okay? And I would suggest that knowing what it is that we're doing that's effective is important, because we all have a responsibility to our schools, to ourselves, and most importantly, to our students, to make sure that we reflect on our own classroom practice in light of what the research tells us works best. And maybe, to change things or to drop things that we're doing that are less effective, and to adopt or develop habits which make the biggest kind of difference. So let's have a quick test, okay? Let's find out how good you already are at assessing what factors make the biggest kind of difference, okay? So here you've got 10 different things that teachers can do or that happen in the classroom. What I'd like you to do is have a quick read through them. Try to decide which one do you think is the most effective, the second most effective, the third most effective, right down to the least effective, okay? Give you a minute just to have a read through, have a think. Maybe you want to just type in the ones that you think will be most effective from there. Which of these different influences or impacts do you think has the biggest effect on learning? Okay. I'll wait a couple of minutes for some of you to type your ideas there. Class size. Yeah, it's a common belief. We'll come to that in a minute. Teacher-student relationships. Okay. Student control. It's another very common contemporary belief that student control impacts learning positively. We'll see. Classroom discussion. It's quite interesting. You all have different ideas. Frequent testing. Number 1, student control. Number 10, frequent testing. Wow. You seem very confident there. Feedback, student control, classroom discussion, personality. Okay, let's go through and let's check what the research actually tells us. Okay, so the factors that impact learning. At number 10, with almost no impact whatsoever on how quickly students develop, is student control over learning. Okay. Next up, personality of the learners. Personality is basically very unimportant according to all of the research. It makes a tiny impact on learning. Class size, similarly, actually doesn't have much impact at all. Teaching test-taking skills, again, not much of an impact, below average impact. Using online digital tools, again, below average impact. Exposure to reading, slightly higher than average impact. Teacher-student relationships, considerably higher than average impact. The top 3 things that make the biggest difference to student progress and student achievement are frequent testing, feedback from the teacher, and classroom discussion. Okay, so quite a few surprises for you there. Interesting how many of you went for student control or, class size or maybe personality, the things that actually don't make much of an impact in terms of how students progress. I think there's a few interesting conclusions from these things, okay? One is that often the factors that politicians, and I'm sure it's the same in Russia as it is here in this sense, that politicians often impose on teachers ideas like, we're going to halve class sizes and make sure all students have access to digital tools. Those kind of quick fixes and easy promises that politicians love to make aren't actually things that make that much difference to learning. Also interesting, a lot of kind of fashionable post-communicative language teaching ideas, such as letting learners take control over their own learning, has very, very limited impact on learning, as does personality. Also interestingly, teaching students exam skills is far less effective than just regular inbuilt testing. Okay? The 2 biggest factors, as you saw, by quite some distance, are feedback and classroom discussion. And obviously, when you read these kind of general, broad brush kind of terms, it's important to then start thinking about, well, what do we actually mean by classroom discussion? What do we mean by feedback? And what does that mean in my own classroom? How can I get better at doing these kinds of things and impacting learning in these kinds of ways? How can I develop as a teacher in a way which will help me to get better at the key areas that impact on student learning? So imagine you take this idea of regular testing, okay? It can mean lots of different things. It can mean starting your new classes with some kind of revision based on particular items, bits of vocabulary, phrases, chunks, bits of grammar that you covered in previous classes. Another way of thinking about testing is it could mean having gapped sentences on the board after a vocabulary exercise or after a speaking activity and eliciting the missing words from your group. It could mean getting students to repeat particular tasks based on particular outcomes, again, but doing it better this time. So maybe in the last lesson, the students had a discussion about their favorites, favorite film, favorite dish, favorite place, favorite movie. They did that talking, you gave some feedback, you gave some input, do it again, check that they're, better than they were last time around. It might mean sometimes giving actual paper tests with scores that you keep on file. And all of these things are basically forms of regular testing. They're all ways that we as teachers can intervene in the process of forgetting. And they're all impacts or activities that we can engage in the classroom that allow the new, the extra information, the new language to be added to what's been studied already. They allow the new to be embedded into the old. So again, have a quick think about what these high impact factors mean for you. Here are some of the highest impact factors, okay? Actually higher than the ones we've seen. Teacher estimates of achievement. This has a huge impact on learning, as does providing formative evaluation. Teacher clarity also has a big impact. Reciprocal teaching has a big impact. Spaced versus mass practice, big impact. Vocab programs, direct instruction, cooperative versus individualistic learning also has a big impact. You don't need to type anything, but have a quick think for you in your context, in your English language classrooms. What do these high impact factors, these high impact teacher directed activities mean for you? How do you do these things in your classroom? Okay, give you a minute thinking time, chin scratching time. We'll talk through them in a minute. So let's have a talk through them and a think through them, okay? When you come to teachers' estimates, okay, this is one of the things that has the biggest impact on learning. I think it basically means the teacher's beliefs about what students can achieve. And this can have a huge impact on what students end up doing. Being Russian teachers, you don't need me to tell you to expect a lot from your students. I've noticed it's quite a kind of common phenomenon among Russian teachers, and I think it's obviously a very good thing. The research backs it up that it's a good thing. And I think what it means is just things like setting, expecting students to do, and checking the homework. Make sure that there's regular micro testing of what you've studied already through the revision activities, so that the students get used to the teacher expecting that they're going to have learned, they're going to have studied. It means focusing on the fact that students have done well and that they're learning, but not just focusing on the fact that they've done well and that they're learning. It also means focusing on the fact that there's still more that they can learn how to do. There's still more they can learn how to say. There's still more they can learn how to write. It's not only seeing the gaps in their language. It's not only seeing the positive aspects of their language. It's seeing the positive and emphasizing the positive, but it's also emphasizing the fact that you expect more of them, that you want them to go further, you want them to do better. Do all of these things, and already we're having a big positive impact on what our students are going to achieve. When you think about providing formative evaluation, I think often the power of immediate feedback on student output impacts achievement in a really sort of almost unparalleled kind of way. So if I'm speaking and I'm practicing my foreign language and you're listening to me and giving me immediate feedback, telling me, you know, yes, I understand you, but a better way of saying that would be this, that's going to have a hugely positive impact on learning. It can also mean, I think, evaluating student output, spoken or written, as it happens, and trying to provide relatively quick feedback on how students have done. It may also mean actually students providing feedback on our classes and accepting that feedback and maybe adjusting our teaching accordingly or changing direction slightly or explaining why we're doing things and having some formative developmental discussion about that. So, you know, the formative evaluation can be two ways. It can be what we give our students after they're speaking, but it can also be what students give us after our lessons and how we, you know, moderate what we're doing in accordance with that particular feedback. You think about teacher clarity, okay? This can mean organization of our lessons, explanation of grammar points, new vocabulary, you know, cultural references. It can mean giving clear examples. It can mean providing guided practice for students. And it can mean clear assessment of student learning. I think it also has implications, this idea of teacher clarity, for how we deal with new vocabulary and new grammar structures. thinking about how we can do them most clearly, most simply, most directly. It also means making sure that we communicate the intentions of our lessons to our students and that we're clear about what we are defining as criteria for success. If we say to students, you're not doing very well, well, have we been clear about what exactly they need to do in order to perform to a degree that we would say is good? We need to know ourselves what the goals are and what the criteria for successful performance are. We need to know how well all the students in the class are progressing. And we need to know and to make clear to our learners where we want them to go next. If we're meeting all those kinds of goals and we're doing those things regularly with a kind of high degree of clarity, again, that's going to impact learning positively. You think about reciprocal teaching. Originally, this was a technique that was developed in secondary schools for tackling reading, where teachers would help students to summarize texts, to question text, to clarify things, to predict, to use dialogue, to develop their own sense of what things mean. And each student would take a turn at leading a dialogue about particular sections of a text. Maybe you've done something similar in high school yourself when you were learning your own first language. In EFL terms, I think, particularly if you're teaching teenagers, this can be adapted. And when you're doing things like project work, it offers a lot of opportunities for the teacher support and teacher scaffolding to slowly be removed as the learners start to take a bit more control over the feedback, over the dialogue, over the summarizing, and allowing a little bit more space for students to interact with each other, to aid and assist each other. Still teacher directed and kind of top-down controlled, but with space within there for the learners themselves to help each other out. Again, it's been shown to be an effective intervention. Spaced versus mass practice is interesting because study after study after study shows that spaced practice, where students are given rest intervals between the practice sessions, results in much better learning than massed practice, where students practice a task continuously without rest. And I think the same applies for not just tasks, but for grammar and for vocabulary. Students learn grammar and vocabulary better if they encounter it over time, spaced out and intermingled with other bits of language, rather than expecting them to learn everything about one particular structure in one massed practice. Sadly, the way lots of coursebooks work, not mine, Outcomes, but other coursebooks out there, the way a lot of those coursebooks work is they mass the practice of the grammar. And so, this makes it harder for teachers to space the practice out, but spacing out works better. Vocabulary programs for any subject where students are having explicit vocabulary instruction and developing their knowledge of how words work and what words mean, it boosts reading comprehension. And the most effective vocabulary teaching methods have been shown to involve looking at both definitions, but also context and, the way in which words work with other words and the way in which words work with grammar, not just the meaning of words. And if we can involve students a bit more in deeper processing, give students more spaced exposure to items, all of that will have a very positive impact on learning. So good vocabulary instruction starts with student-friendly definitions, and then from there it moves on to looking at how the words are used in a wide, rich range of examples. Direct instruction, again, it's sort of an unfashionable idea because it often involves the dreaded teacher talking time. But the explicit teaching of a carefully sequenced curriculum of knowledge and of skills has been shown to have very positive impacts on learning. And it sort of contradicts, it flies in the face of this kind of trendy idea at the moment of content being dictated by learners, or of, dogma style teaching, implicit learning, or problem-based learning. What the research shows us is that teachers who know what they're going to teach, why they're teaching it, and who set out to teach it as well as they can, make a significant difference to learning. A far more significant difference to learning than teachers who don't. Cooperative versus individualistic learning is interesting again. There's a lot of emphasis placed in this day and age on the individual. But actually what's really important in terms of learning in a classroom is the primacy of the group over the individual. It's a bit like with football teams, where you have a football team that has one or two star players, but they don't play well as a team. That team is vulnerable to a group who have no star players, but who work very, very tightly and very well together as a group. And this is most powerful when students have already acquired sufficient background knowledge and background language to be involved in discussions and in learning with their peers. And the effects increase with age, actually. The older the group is, the more significant the impact on learning is when there's a kind of cooperative group-based dynamic and, a kind of cooperative group-based approach to learning as a unit as opposed to as individuals. Hattie's work has been criticised, of course, everyone's work gets criticised. Some of the statistics have been called into question. Some people have said Hattie's kind of comparing oranges with apples. Here's a particularly negative quote about his idea. To believe Hattie is to have a blind spot in one's critical thinking when assessing scientific rigour, etc. And it's good to be aware of the criticisms of his work, but he spent 20 years analysing and studying these things. And while there may be particular problems with the statistics or particular problems with certain elements of his approach, and while a degree of scepticism may be a useful thing, I think it's still worth bearing in mind the kind of, the reality of his work and the degree to which you think it's relevant to your own teaching context. Interestingly, it's not only Hattie who comes up with these ideas. There are many other sort of meta studies of what impacts learning that echo and reiterate a lot of the ideas that Hattie's put forward. In the UK, there's a group called the Sutton Trust. They're an independent charitable organisation, and their main stated goal is to broaden high impact learning to ensure that excellent learning is delivered across as many different social and educational contexts as it can be. And in their most recent report, 2014, they spent 4 years looking at high impact learning across a wide range of different contexts in the UK. And what they came up with in terms of things that have strongest impact on student outcomes, one of them was pedagogical content knowledge. This idea that the most effective teachers have a deep knowledge of the subjects they teach. And this is where the whole idea of native versus non-native is interesting, because this doesn't mean just knowing a lot of English. It also obviously means a kind of a deep understanding of how the language actually works, the way in which words and grammar interact, the way in which genres work, the way in which spoken language is different from written language, and so on. It also means, I think, that teachers need to understand the way students think about content. We need to evaluate the thinking behind students' approaches to learning. We need to be good at identifying common misconceptions that both teachers and students may have about learning. That's all part of what our content knowledge involves as teachers of English as a foreign language. Another thing that the Sutton Trust found has strong impact on student outcomes was the quality of instruction. This means effective questioning, asking the best kinds of questions we can in the classroom. effective use of assessment by teachers. It means reviewing, revising, going over again previous learning. It means providing model responses or model answers for students, ourselves. Yet more dreaded teacher talking time, but apparently good practice. It means giving adequate time for practice in the classroom to allow new skills and new language to embed themselves securely. And it means progressively introducing new learning, scaffolding and building up to the stage where we expect students to produce new learning. An area that the Sutton Trust says has a moderate impact on learning is the classroom climate. This includes the kind of quality of interaction between teachers and students. It includes student expectations. It includes, as Hattie was saying, the need to create classrooms that are constantly demanding more while still recognizing students' sense of self, students' sense of achievement already, students' self-worth. It means attributing student success to effort rather than ability. It means valuing resilience to failure, okay? Not just saying, wow, you're good, you're bad, but wow, you're getting better because you've made a lot of effort. I can see that you did your homework. I can see the work that you've been putting in, and I'm impressed with how much impact that's allowed you to make, how much progress you've made as a result. It also means valuing and prioritizing the group over the individual, as Hattie said again, and working to make sure the group pull together as a unit. Another area that the Sutton Trust say has a positive impact is classroom management. A moderate impact, but an above average impact. So this means things like efficient use of lesson time, using the classroom space and the classroom resources, managing behaviour, having clear rules that we consistently enforce. All of this helps to maximise learning. And these environmental factors are how we create the spaces and the times within which effective learning can occur. In a way, this kind of stuff is like the foundation or the bedrock of all the other good things that we do as classroom teachers. Teacher beliefs also has some impact, and thinking about why certain teachers adopt particular practices, what aims they hope to achieve, teachers' theories about what learning is, how learning happens, teachers' kind of mind models of the nature and role of teaching in the learning process, all seem to be important. In other words, if there's going to be a kind of pedagogical shift or a shift in the way that, individual teachers work in their own classrooms, it helps if they buy into that particular change or that particular shift. You can't implement change or forced change on teachers without a discussion that leads to the teachers themselves buying into the idea of an improvement or a change. He also the Sutton Trust also suggests that professional behaviours have some impact. These include things like reflecting on and developing your practice, taking part in professional development activities, attending webinars like this one, supporting your colleagues, liaising and communicating with parents, all things that I'm sure are very familiar to many of you. Just a few caveats, okay, before we move on. Neither Hattie nor the Sutton Trust focus on English language teaching. There's yet to be a kind of comprehensive meta-analysis of English language teaching related studies. So maybe if any of you are looking for a subject for your PhD, that might be a good one to do. But we are part of the broader educational field, and I think we can learn a lot by looking at the bigger picture. In the end, the way that learning occurs isn't different completely from subject to subject. There has to be common similarities between subjects that impact on learning. So, just going to sort of move on really and make 10 top tips for English language teachers based on the work of Hattie and the work of the Sutton Trust. So the first thing is, as English language teachers, I think it's good to be clear about what we want our students to learn. And it's good for us to share this knowledge with them. You know, this is what we're going to be teaching. This is what we expect you to learn. This is what we're going to try and teach you. This is what you need to learn in order to be successful. This is what we're going to test you on. Knowing where students are at currently in that area and working towards developing the language needed to master the material, it's important. And if we want our learners to make effective progress, we need to be clear ourselves about what kind of content, what kind of input is going to help them do this most effectively. As I said, spacing practice out rather than massing practice has been proven to have positive impacts. As I also said, the way that many course books treat language isn't particularly effective. That kind of PPP-based massed presentation of grammar, it's far less effective than breaking things down into more manageable, bite-sized chunks, giving students little grammar olives regularly across a period of time, rather than force-feeding them huge, great big, unhealthy grammar burgers in one go. It's more healthy, it's more useful, it's more productive. Spacing out the way in which learners encounter grammatical structures and vocabulary over time has a very positive impact on learning, I think. Then there's this idea of interleaving, which basically means mixing or not just focusing on things in isolation. Presenting and practicing structures in isolation and presenting and practicing vocabulary just as words isolated from other lexical items and isolated from grammar, it's relatively ineffective. It's much better to mix up the new items with the old, to allow students to try and embed what they've recently encountered with what they already know. And one of the main ways in which we can do this is one of the things that Hattie suggests. It's to allow more conversation, more speaking, and particularly speaking and conversation that's not just practicing one particular structure, but which is practicing a sort of conversation type and that allows the new to be interwoven with the old. Yeah, someone said, can you give an example of spaced practice? What it might mean, for example, Katerina, is instead of just doing one big lesson on, say, the present perfect at intermediate or pre-intermediate level, it might mean doing different things with the present perfect at different times in different lessons and looking at how the present perfect interacts with different vocabulary to have different kinds of conversations. So maybe you do a lesson on holidays, and in that lesson you do, have you ever been to? And you do a range of answers, you know, no, never, yes, quite a few times, no, but I'd love to, no, but I've never really wanted to. In another lesson, you might talk about society, and you might look at the present perfect for talking about changes. So it might be things like prices have gone up a lot over the last few years. Inflation has doubled since the last election. Unemployment has dropped 10% this year. In another lesson, you might look at problems. So it might be things like asking questions. Have you tried talking to him about it? Have you tried turning it off and turning it on again? Have you been to the doctor about it? Not yet, but I'm going to tomorrow. Not yet. I'll see how I feel tomorrow. Yes, I have. I went yesterday. So it's basically thinking about revisiting things like the present perfect simple across a range of different topics with a range of different vocabulary, rather than doing one big massed practice lesson where you're thinking, okay, we've done the present perfect, because learning doesn't work like that. Okay, much better to have a range of different conversations where you're practicing structures, interacting, interweaving with each other, rather than just practicing the present perfect, just practicing the present continuous, just practicing first conditionals. Another top tip, testing has been shown to improve things for students quite dramatically. So doing regular low stress or no stress, where there's nothing resting on the test scores, or there are no test scores officially kept. They're low stakes, no stakes tests. They prepare students to do better generally in higher stakes tests, when there's pressure on them, when it's an end of year test or a university entrance test. But they also encourage learning. At the moment, my daughter, she's 9, she has weekly spelling tests from school. And I wouldn't say she enjoys doing them. Every morning we go through the words, she writes them down, I tell her the ones she gets wrong. Every evening we do it again. By the end of the week, I just focus on the ones she has problems with. Usually at the beginning of the week, she's getting 2 or 3 out of 10 correct. By the Thursday evening, Friday morning, she's getting 9 or 10 out of 10 correct. And that's the score she gets in her class. It's not fun. She doesn't particularly enjoy it, but she enjoys knowing that she can spell better than she used to. So, sometimes I think doing a bit of testing, even though it's not what students will beg you for, it's something that encourages learning. And it also makes learning visible. Okay, if you've got students who feel I'm not developing, I'm not progressing, and you do these little tests where you say, okay, here are 20 sentences from last week. There are 20 words missing in pairs. Can you remember what those missing words were? What that does is when the students get 16 out of 20, is it shows them, hey, you're making progress. You've learned 16 things that you didn't know last week. Next week, try and get 17, okay? You can do it. It creates this culture of high expectation. It creates clearly defined measures of success. And as I said before, it creates this kind of intervention in the process of forgetting. Thinking about feedback, but feeding not only back on the errors that students have just made, but feeding forward to similar kind of output that students might produce in the future can also have a positive impact. Students need feedback on their output, on what they've done or written, said or written. We need feedback that clarifies where they went wrong, why they went wrong, and we need feedback that clarifies how they can do better in future. And opportunities for us to provide feedback are everywhere. We find them, excuse me, I'm just putting some sort of face cream on because I'm drying up here. It's quite a hot day here. We have opportunities for feedback when we're dealing with pronunciation, when we're dealing with speaking, when we're dealing with writing. And I think good feedback from teachers is how learners realise how near to or how far from success they were when they tried to do what we ask them to do. And good feedback is also how we make it clear to them what they need to do next in order to progress further. Forge strong relationships with your students. Don't just treat them as producers of incorrect English or, not as good as you'd like them to be pronouncers of English or deficient users of, someone, can I get a record of the webinar? Yeah, if you email me, I'll send you the PowerPoint, okay? Let me just put my email address up there, hugh@lexicallab.com. Just email me and I'll send you the PowerPoint, okay? So yeah, treating your students as humans, not just as students, finding out about them as people, not just as language users. When you find out more about them as people, you can use your knowledge of them as people to hang new language on. You can look for ways to connect what you're giving them to the worlds that they inhabit. Give students plenty of chances to learn more about each other. Not just about how good they are at English, but what they're like as people. Change where they sit, mix up the weak and the strong students. When you hear stories from weaker students, take those stories and retell them for the whole class in better English. Work on techniques that increase rapport. Smile, smile more, laugh, tell stories, include yourself in the stories that you're telling, okay? Where are we next? 1 second. Yeah. Give worked examples. Students produce better output if they have input from us that scaffolds and supports their learning. Okay? So you can use the students to build on the examples by asking them about the items you're teaching. Imagine that you want them to practice some phrasal verbs. You've done a vocabulary exercise. Maybe you have something like look up to in there. You can ask any reasons why maybe you look up to people. What kind of people might you look up to? What's the opposite of looking up to someone? Can you think of anyone you looked up to when you were at school? For example, for me, when I was 16, I used to look up to, and then give your own example. Help them say what they're trying to say better, and use their output to give new input that helps them say things better. Before you want students to do speaking tasks, model the speaking task yourself. When you're getting students to do exercises, do the first one with the whole class first. They're relevant when you're going through answers, particularly to grammar exercises. Ask why the right answers are right, so that you're not just giving the answers, but you're kind of unpeeling the thought processes. You're unpeeling the rationale behind the correct choices. So students see the correct answers and they get a sense of why the correct answers are correct and why the wrong answers are wrong. Another tip, own the room. You know, you're in control of that room. Make the most of your time. Trouble before trouble troubles you. Deal with any behavioural problems in the class quickly and effectively. Managing classroom behaviour and ensuring that there's mutual respect, good manners, ensuring that you make clear the limit of what you think is acceptable for students to say, ensuring that you have a productive use of time. All of this basically means that you then maximize the opportunities that are available for learning, and you maximize the amount of time available for learning. Without a strong grasp of these kind of classroom management fundamentals, none of the other excellent techniques that you may possess are going to stand much of a chance of occurring. So as teachers, you know, we need to be comfortable and confident. We need to own that room. We need to make sure we are the boss of the room and that everyone knows it. And, you know, it doesn't mean you have to be a tyrant or a dictator. You can still be friendly, but, you know, be friendly and firm. Be kind and confident. Make clear from the beginning what you will and what you won't put up with. Just as with children, you know, children need to know the limits. Students in a classroom need to know the limits. Questions are an important part of what we do in the classroom. Questions check understanding. Questions encourage student involvement. And questions create a space where we can use the learners to add to what's already been grasped. And I think what this means for language teachers particularly is thinking more about the kinds of questions about language that you're looking at, and thinking about how the questions we ask students as we're going through vocabulary exercises or as we're dealing with vocabulary can generate further connected language. So, for example, imagine that you're teaching fed up. Okay, you might ask the students, yeah, what kind of things might you be fed up with? So, you know, you can be fed up with the weather, fed up with work, fed up with your children, fed up with your husband or wife, fed up with your boss, fed up with all the football on TV. Then you can ask why. You know, fed up with the weather, why? Oh, it doesn't stop raining. It's too hot, it's too humid. Fed up with your boss, why? He puts too much pressure on you. It's always breathing down your neck. And these kind of well-aimed questions allow students a chance to develop their own voice. They help to develop bonds in the classroom. They give you the chance to learn a bit more about your learners. They help to increase the level, and they check that the items you're trying to give the students are being absorbed. They provide a chance to offer further feedback, further input, further exploration and development of the items that you're working on. And they go a lot further than, if you're fed up, are you happy? No. That doesn't go anywhere in terms of the classroom. Thinking about better questions and more open questions that leave more space for learners is a great way in which we can make the classroom more interactive, encourage more classroom discussion, space out exposure to grammatical structures, and so on. Finally, adopt evidence-based strategies. It may be some of you are still sitting there angry about the first 5 minutes of this talk, thinking, no, I must stick to learning styles. Well, I can't stop you from doing that, but the vast bulk of the research tells you it's not a great idea. Perhaps most fundamentally of all, for all of us as teachers, we need to be looking to improve our teaching in light of what the research tells us is most effective. Your actions can make a huge difference to classrooms. They can help students overcome other problems. They can help them overcome shyness. They can help them overcome large class sizes, lack of ability to study at home, etc. But they can only do this if we're operating at the highest, most effective ends of the spectrum. Just to finish really and leave some time for us to discuss things together, a final thought. Obviously, it's nice as a teacher to be told teachers matter, and I could finish by doing that and giving you a cheap feel-good kind of catchphrase to go away with. But personally, I'm not that interested in this kind of feel-good cheerleading teachers matter kind of idea. What matters is not just teachers, but good teaching. Okay, good teaching matters. And I think some approaches to what we do as teachers are far more likely to have a large impact than other approaches. And as a result, it makes sense to start by focusing more and prioritizing more those areas in our own teaching and in the way we develop. Of course, ultimately, how and when and if any of that happens is totally up to you. I hope what I've done today is to maybe reassure you that a lot of what you're doing already in the classroom is positive, is having a larger than average impact, and maybe to make you think a little bit more about other research-based effective ways of impacting on learning that you might want to go away and think more about what you're doing within the classroom than you have done already. Just to finish, I run a website with my co-author, www.lexicallab.com, where we blog about language and we blog about language teaching, this kind of thing. We also run summer schools here in the UK. I'm just going to send a link for you all for that. We run a range of summer schools in July and August, both teacher development and language development courses. Let me just send a link for you there. There you go. You can also email me at any point. It's hugh@lexicallab.com. I'm on Facebook, I'm on VK, so I'm easy to find if you want to find me.